Hey, this is Dino, and I want to show you how to use Google Cloud Monitoring to get alerts on Apigee API proxies, specifically when the 400 range status code exceeds a configured threshold, let's say 5%, 8%, 15%, you want to get an alert when that happens, or when the 500 series status codes exceed that threshold. Sort of up to you whether you want it to be, what condition you want it to be. But in some general sense, errors. So how would we do that? Well, we've got Apigee running, and in my case, I've got some load running through my Apigee API proxies. I've got let me flip over to the terminal. I have just a synthetic load driver that's sending in some requests just for the purposes of this demonstration. So we have some requests to look at. Now I'm going to flip over to monitoring, and you can get that just by searching here. Then in the left hand, when you go to the left hand side, go to Metrics Explorer. This is going to be pretty neat. You're going to be able to see the metrics immediately on Apigee. So click Select a Metric. You may need to deselect the active button there. Just unclick that. And maybe search by proxy. You'll see Apigee Proxy and Apigee Proxy v2. We want proxy, not v2. Make sure you get that. And then click Proxy, and Apigee will collect metrics on different things. I've done a video on latencies. Now I'm going to do this quick exploration of how to get alerts on status codes, and whether you're having an error or not. Okay, so I've just clicked this metric, and it's telling me how many responses I have per second in a chart. So I've had this load generator running for about 10 minutes, and you can see the load curve right there, and we're right around 10 per second. That's what we're seeing. But I want to get something a little more interesting. Here I can add filters. So as one example, I could filter on the proxy name, and it'll prompt me with different proxies that are actually receiving load. And now I can see, well, for this particular proxy, this is the kind of response traffic I'm getting. So that's interesting, but I don't really want to filter on that. I'd like to filter on the response code. Specifically, I want to see the 400 errors. And this is what it looks like over that same time period during which the load generator has been running. And you can see I had a little over 2.5 requests per second that were returning the 400 status code, and then declining, and it's sort of fluctuating. And so we can see that over time. Now, it's pretty easy to set an alert on the absolute value of the number of responses. So we could say, well, if it ever exceeds 2 per second, then I want to get an alert. In general, that's not a good idea. It's not a good practice because load will fluctuate, and 2 per second on Sunday might be an okay threshold, but 2 per second on Monday or on a busy day would not be a good threshold because your overall load has increased, and that might be just 400 errors out of a very high volume might not be a significant alert-worthy condition. So really what you want is to get alerted when the percentage of error responses exceeds a certain threshold that's interesting to you or appropriate for your scenario. So how would we do that? Well, for that, we need to get a ratio. And for that, I think the best way to do that is to resort not to the visual builder, but to what's called PromQL, or the Prometheus query language. This is the query that Google Cloud Monitoring was using for its Prometheus server to get this curve. So it's basically using all of this information, all of this stuff, to get the rate of 400 status codes. And I can fiddle around with this. Let's make it 200, and we can look at the 200. So that's obviously a very different curve. Most of my calls on all the proxies are getting 200 responses. If I want to look at 429, I can change that. run that query, and we'll see a different one. So that peaked around 1.2 per second a few minutes ago, and has declined since then. Okay, so this is Prometheus query language. And it's probably not familiar to you unless you've worked with Prometheus before. So let's just take a few minutes to just explore it a little bit. The core metric that we're looking at here is this thing, this proxy response count. So let me grab that. And I want to just look at that. So I can do a query on just that. And this is interesting. So this looks like a stepwise, steadily increasing value over time. This is expected. This is how Prometheus works. There's a number of different metrics that Prometheus can collect, including Google Cloud Monitoring. Different types of metrics. One is called a gauge, and that might be something like CPU usage percentage. So it varies. It varies over time. It might go from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100. It's just a gauge. There can be it could be a temperature probe, lots of other things that you might monitor with a gauge. Things like request counts and response counts are usually done with what's called a counter in Prometheus. And this is a monotonically increasing count. Basically, the thing that is being monitored, the system that's being monitored, in this case, the Apigee system, just collects the number of responses at a running tally of the number of responses. And Prometheus gets that information at different time intervals and then can render, this is what it looks like over time. It's varied this way. Generally, we don't want to see how many responses have been sent through Apigee as of a certain time of day. We want to see things like the rate. And we want to see the rate in maybe per second over a given interval. So the way to do that in PromQL is to use the rate function and to specify a time interval. So for example, let's do 1 minute. Over 1 minute periods, let's look at that data. So this is what the transaction rate looks like in terms of queries per second or requests per second over the past, whatever it is, 10 minutes or so. And obviously we can change that with this drop down and see different time intervals. But we got a number of different lines. And what do those lines correspond to? What are all these different lines? You've got a legend down here that sort of explains that a little bit. It's easier to see what's going on if I click the table. So this is the data table for 1 moment in time for this query. And it's saying I've got different data points for proxy name and response code. Those are labels on the metric that's being collected. And then the value, and this is the rate value. So for this proxy name and that response code, my rate is about 5.017 as of this moment per second. For 400 response codes for that same proxy, it's 0.142 per second. And Prometheus is collecting that, and with the rate function, it's telling us the results there. If I rerun this, it may change over time. You may see these different combinations change. So that's something interesting that we can do. Another thing we can do is introduce filters into this metric. And I can do that with a curly brace there. And I can filter on these labels. So a label like response code or proxy name, for example. So I could put in proxy name equals, and I'll just choose one of those that's showing up there, retype my query and run it again. And what we'll see is now the restriction, the filter has eliminated all those other proxies from consideration, and now we're only looking at the responses for this particular proxy. And you can see I still have a number of different lines corresponding to different response codes. So the 400 response code looks like that, the 200 looks like that, the 429 looks like that, 403 is almost flat, almost, no responses at 403. Okay, so that's interesting. what if we wanted to look at just the response codes that are 400? For that, I can add a comma and filter further, put in response code equals 400. So let's run that query, and now you should see a single line as expected. And of course, if I change this to 200, I'll see the 200 line just for this API proxy. You know, this is how PromQL works. All right. Now, if I exclude this proxy name, now I'm going to see all the 400 and modify this to 400. Now I'm going to see all the 400s for all proxies, and that's what it looks like, and aggregated across all different proxies in my system. Okay, so the thing I mentioned earlier was I'd really like to see 400 series errors, not specifically 400, because there are also 401s, there's 400s, there's 401s, you know, there's a number of different 400 series errors. So really what I want to do is anything greater than or equal to 400. And this looks really attractive to try something like that. But when we type that in and run the query, it tells us you can't do that. You can't use a greater than symbol here. And this is kind of a known problem. In fact, the Prometheus engine that is used by Google Cloud Platform for Google Cloud Monitoring doesn't support either label regexes or inequality operators for integer labels, which is a fancy way of saying this thing that we tried to do is not supported. I also can't do, for string labels, for things like, let's say the proxy name. If I replace this filter with proxy name, I can do something like twiddle equals twiddle and specify a regex here, so a regular expression. So I might do something like ml-dot plus, and that's going to say any proxy name that begins with ml dash and ends with, I don't know, anything. And this is effectively the message logging example proxy that I told you about. And of course, you could have other examples in here. It could be you know, any name convention here. A name that begins with T. Here's a different proxy. It's actually test 563 03475. It's the name of the proxy, but you'll see different data for that. So full regular expression matching support on labels like proxy name that are strings, but not for labels like response code that are integers. Can't do that. Can't match on a regex. So I have to do something like 400. So how do I get information for all of the 400 series response codes? Well, there's a way to do that by summing a number of different collections of these. And that looks like this. If I drop this in, so now I've got the same rate expression that we saw before over the course of 5 minutes for 400, 401, 403, and 429. And I can see the curve for that. This is currently set to, I don't know why, 1 minute. Let's look at 15 minutes. Okay, so for the past 15 minutes, if we want to go a little further, maybe 30 minutes, we'll see a different curve. So you can see there was no load. I started the load runner. It went up, it went back down. Now it's kind of coming back up a little bit. This is across all of those 400 series errors. So that's super interesting. Now I could potentially set up an alert based on this threshold. So these are per second rates because we're using this rate, and that's what the rate function does. If I look in the query, the reference implementation for PromQL, it tells us this is the per second average of a time series. So that's what we're seeing here. This rate is giving us 3 per second, 4 per second. This is about 3.67 of 400 errors per second at that moment in time. I don't really want that. We talked about this before. We don't want an absolute. So what if we could get a ratio? And why not? PromQL supports that as well. So I could do something like this, where I am summing all of the counts for these 400 errors and then dividing it by the sum of the rate for all requests over the same period, 5-minute period. So let's have a look at that, and then I'll multiply that by 100 to get a percentage. So at this point I can run that query, and now what we're seeing is a percentage. This y-axis is now a percentage. And we saw over time that it was around 45% a few minutes ago, then it declined to around 2%. Now we're hovering around 14%. So that's useful. That's something we can actually do create an alert on. Even more interesting is to be able to convert this into a square wave, where basically the answer is yes, I should be alerted, or no, I should not. And in order to do that, we can use a comparison in PromQL. So I can do something like bool, let's say 20%, greater than 20. Now I've got a new query, I can run that, and you can see there's the square wave. So during this interval, this ratio that I've computed, that is to say the sum of all the responses that were in the 400 series divided by the sum of all responses sent in total, exceeds 20%. So this is a square wave, and if I change that to something like 13% and rerun it, you'll see the square wave has now 2 on switches, where this is when it was really high, the ratio was really high, and this is when it was just over 14%. So you can see we've got the square wave, and this is something that we can now use to build an alert. So let's grab that. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back into my cloud dashboard. Again, search for monitoring. That's where you want to be. And now I'm going to navigate to alerting. Create a policy. The builder is not going to give us access to that kind of aggregation that we wanted, so I'm going to use the code editor. Click that radio button, make sure I have PromQL selected, and paste in that that query that I used in the Metrics Explorer. And again, we can kind of remove that, and we'll get a visualization of what this looked like over the past hour or so, or 6 hours. We could see on the chart what that would have looked like for the ratio of 400 to all responses. But let's insert the threshold, and we'll make sure that that's our square wave. That's a thing that's going to, flip to 1 when we want to be alerted, and be at 0 when we don't. So that's our PromQL. Click Next. We'll say when any time series violates, when any time series goes to 1, basically. There is only one time series, this one, so that's the right thing. And we can evaluate this every, 30 seconds. That's sort of up to you. This condition is actually going to show up in the notification, so we're going to want to name this. It's going to say 4xx errors exceed, I don't remember what I put, 13%, something like that. That's our name for the condition. Notification channel, you have to have this previously set up. I won't go into detail on what those look like, but in email, the subject line will be API alert, and this will be 4xx exceeds figured threshold. It'll automatically raise an incident, and we can set the auto close duration on that, and so on. And then we just create the alert policy name. So, and you can name this whatever you want. We'll just pick a unique name. And then if I click next again, it'll show me a review of that thing. So this is kind of where we are on this alert, and I now can create that policy. At this point, I'm going to get notified via email when now that this alert is active, anytime my 400 errors exceed that threshold that I've configured. Anytime I want to modify this or look at it, kind of remind myself what I did, I can just go into the editor and kind of review the PromQL and so on. And here is an example of the alert email that I got from that alert policy that I configured. You can see the condition name that I put in there, name of the project, when it alerted, name of the policy, and the value that was observed. And then I can click through to view the incident in Cloud Monitoring. So I hope this has been helpful. This has been a good introduction to configuring alerting and monitoring in Google Cloud Monitoring for Apigee managed APIs. Until next time, keep it digital.